Today's federal budget is expected to deliver a $9.3 billion surplus for the current financial year. The Treasurer Jim Chalmers has defended the government's optimistic inflation forecast, believing the budget will put downward pressure on inflation. Joining us live is independent economist Saul Eslake. Saul, always appreciate tapping your brain, especially around budget time. Thank you for sharing your time with us. How do you best explain the differences we've seen in forecasts between just a week ago from the RBA and in this budget? And do you expect this budget really can walk that fine line between putting downwards pressure on inflation but also helping with the cost of living measures?
Well, first of all, Ash, thank you for having me on the program. I always enjoy being here and talking about these things with you. In this particular instance, I think Treasurer Jim Chalmers is right to say that the budget, if it's like last year's, will include some measures that have a mechanical impact on the CPI measure of inflation. And that's because what the CPI actually measures is what consumers pay for the goods and services that are included in the CPI, rather than the prices that are actually charged by the providers of those goods and services. So if the government, for example, as it did last year, and as it seems it's going to do this year, says that by giving people $300 via their electricity retailer that can be used to reduce the amount they pay on their electricity bills, that will reduce the way in which electricity prices are measured in the CPI. It will have a downward impact on inflation. And the same was true of the increase in the childcare subsidies that were part of last year's budget, that I don't expect to be repeated in this year's budget. And it was also true of the increase in Commonwealth rent assistance that's paid to people on pensions and benefits who are renting in the private market rather than in social housing. That reduces the rent that they pay as measured in the consumer price index. So there is a mechanical downward impact on inflation from measures like this, which the Reserve Bank a week ago explicitly said it wasn't taking into account in its inflation forecast because it didn't know whether there were going to be any of those measures in the budget. It hasn't been announced yet. Against that, you have to consider the impact on inflation of the fact that if people aren't spending as much on electricity bills or rent as they otherwise would have done, they have more money to spend on other things, which potentially results in increased demand for those other things and, again, potentially in increases in the price of those things in a generally inflationary environment. The key to judging how significant that is how much money is the government throwing around and who it's throwing around to. And to put a figure around that, if, for example, the sum total of these measures in terms of the cost of the budget in 2024-25 is, say, $2.5 billion, bearing in mind that the economy itself will be worth $2.7 trillion or so in 2024-25, then that amounts to less than 0.1 of a percentage point of GDP that's spent in that way. I would say that isn't big enough to have a material impact on the inflation rate. And so on net, the government is probably right to say what they're doing will exert a downward influence on inflation, not necessarily a permanent one, but at least a one-off impact on inflation in that way. Ultimately, we have to see tonight how much money is being thrown around. If they throw it around the way the Queensland government, for example, did a few weeks ago with $1,000 being given to all electricity consumers in that state, whether they need it or not, then that almost certainly would be inflationary. But I think what the government does tonight in the budget will be better targeted than what Queensland is doing.
Well, we know, Saul, that treasurers love delivering surpluses, and Jim Chalmers is pulling that off this evening by the sounds of it. But after that, in the next few years, it looks like we can expect budgets to be in the red. What else will you be looking out for tonight when you start pouring through those budget papers?
Well, there's a few things that I certainly will be looking at. One is to see to what extent the government buries the measures it's likely to undertake under the banner of Future Made in Australia in an area of the budget that almost no one looks at, which is what's called in the budget papers transactions in financial assets for policy purposes. These represent the difference between the so-called underlying balance which we've been trained to regard as the measure of the budget's bottom line, and the so-called headline balance, which is simply the difference between receipts and payments, that despite the name doesn't attract headlines and in fact doesn't really attract any scrutiny at all. This was where the Howard Costello government used to record the proceeds of selling shares in Telstra, but in recent years, it's actually been a vehicle for money going out the other way. For example, the Rudd government and its successors funneled $30 billion to the NBN through this area. The Turnbull government put $6 billion into Snowy through this area. Barnaby Joyce's Northern Australia boondoggle was funded to the tune of almost $2 billion through this particular area. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation's loans and investments are funded here. And I suspect that money that the government hands out to companies to induce more investment in manufacturing, for example, could be buried there as well. And in particular, could be buried in an area that's classified as, we can't tell you how much for commercial in confidence reasons. So that's an area I'll be looking at. And more broadly, I'll be wanting to see the extent to which the Treasurer has put in place measures to prevent the future made in Australia leading to or exposing the government to the sort of risks that were identified by the IMF in its fiscal monitor that was released in Washington the week that the Treasurer was there. I'm very worried about the potential for wasting large sums of taxpayers' money subsidising the production of things that Australia has no competitive advantage in. So I'll be looking there. I'll be looking, and this won't surprise you, at the table up the back of budget paper number 3, which deals with federal-state financial relations, to see how much even more the dirty deal with Western Australia to give it more GST revenue than it should be getting is going to cost. Remember that in my EFO, the cost of that was revised up to $39.8 billion over 11 years. That was on the assumption that the iron ore price drops to $65 by the September quarter of this year. Well, that's not going to happen, clearly. And so the cost of that dirty deal will have increased, and I want to know by how much. Then, as you say, the government's likely to forecast budget deficits from 2024-25 onwards. They'll do that in part on the basis of conservative assumptions about commodity prices. Almost certainly, though, they'll forecast a deficit for the coming fiscal year. They might actually make a surplus when the results are finally in, just as they did for the year that's about to end. But beyond that, the budget is in structural deficit, and what I'd like to see, but what I don't expect to find, is some strategy from the government to either cut spending in areas other than healthcare, aged care, disability care, defence and interest, or alternatively to raise revenue from somewhere in a way to close that gap so that we don't have year after year budget deficits that have to be funded by increased debt. But especially if this is the last budget before the next election, I think I'm probably more likely to see a thylacine on my front lawn tomorrow morning than I am to find any detail about that.